Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome back. This is episode 2 of the Metal Guitar Academy podcast, and I am your host and metal marauder, Brett Miller. And I thought today it might be fun just to have a little bit of a talk about some of the guitar magazines, especially the older ones, or the ones that are maybe now defunct. And there are some that are still around. But I think some of the hidden gems really are the ones that are unfortunately no longer with us. And I'm talking specifically about Guitar for the Practicing Musician, or GFTPM, I guess sometimes people like to write it as, although it seems a bit more cumbersome even to say the abbreviation for that particular word. So I'm outside of my studio, my recording studio today. I'm actually set up in my living room and fortunate enough to be watching over my close to 20-year-old cat, who unfortunately has been having the last couple days some pretty major medical issues, although today she does seem to be doing better, and I'm very, very thankful for that. You know, you never know for how long, but as of right now, I'm very thankful for that stressful cat medical days for the last few days. So I am rocking the mobile setup, which is cool. You know, we're pretty fortunate nowadays to have the type of recording equipment where it's not breaking the bank to get yourself in the mix here. And you know, I definitely have a bit more of an ambitious setup, I'd say, than most people. You know, let's just call them your average podcasters, right? So my podcasting thing is kind of a step down from what I normally do with my solo records and with my current band 1900. And of course, it's always a double-edged sword, though, right? Because you know, while it is a lot easier for people to get into the mix here now. To get their hands on this equipment where you don't have to lay out thousands and thousands of dollars to get into a studio and deal with scheduling and all this kind of crap. You can do things on your own now, okay? And that's such a blessing. However, there's so much more, let's face it, garbage to wade through because everybody can do this stuff. Now, listen, everybody certainly has the right to record, whether it's music, whether it's okay, but it is a lot harder now to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? I would say cream used to rise a lot easier years and years ago, okay? Because frankly, you just had to have the type of ambition to get into the studio, to raise the money, to save the money. Okay, and again, this is before my time. Listen, I'm 40 years old. I was born in 1980. So by the time I started making records, I had computer stuff. Okay, it was a pretty crappy setup at first. I didn't know what I was doing. Let's face it. The first record, Constant, although I like the music, I mean, the sound quality really isn't that great compared to stuff that I do today. But I was able to do it. I was able to do it while juggling a lot of other things at the time, because I didn't have to deal with coming up with thousands upon thousands of dollars. Okay. And I also did not have to schedule, right? So I could write, I could do my own process. Speaking of, looks like I'm getting a little bit of dropout as I talk about my setup here. So hopefully it doesn't mess things up too much today. But listen, it is a double-edged sword, right? Because you have so many people putting out records, putting out music, and it's hard for people now to wade through things to find things that are higher quality. So that is the problem with this stuff. But I do think that the benefits outweigh, because you still have to be pretty serious. You know, let's face it, to spend enough to get a decent amount of good equipment, to do it enough to know what you're doing when you're mixing, when you're mastering, when you're tracking, if you're miking, right? I do most things, I would say, direct, just right into the computer. Only things I tend to mic are going to be vocals, are going to be narrations, and acoustic guitar. It's really a blessing to have these things, where you don't have to have a gigantic space either. But anyway, again, I digress, right? The magazines are really what we're talking about. Now, I remember Guitar for the Practicing Musician, right? The first issue I ever got of that, way back in like 1991, I want to say, or maybe even late 1990. Again, I started playing guitar when I was 10 years old, and the cover had Skid Row. So I believe that they had just released, I'm not sure what song it was. I bet you it was their first record, just based on the way that they looked, frankly. I can remember the cover. And who was that? Dave the Snake Sabo, and Sebastian Bach, pretty clever. Pretty damn good voice on that guy, especially those first couple records, my God. And so what I first recall, other than being a new guitar player, and I don't care whether you're a kid, whether you're an adult, when you're starting out with this, when you're starting out with guitar, it's really great to read these magazines because, A, you learn so much just about the gear, right? I mean, part of the fun stuff here, let's face it, especially electric guitar, it's the gear, it's the toys, right? It's the pedals and it's the effects and the rack stuff and the different kinds of strings and picks, all this cool stuff. And the magazines are still the best way to learn about that. I don't care. I know there's tons of YouTube videos, but like you're going to waste so much time looking at that stuff if you can just read a magazine. You're reading about it. People are talking about how they're using it, okay, live and in the studio. So that was really great, even though I wasn't a big gearhead ever. Again, it was more just a financial thing when I was a kid. Not that I was poor, but we certainly weren't rich either. I say we were solidly middle class. And, so I pretty much had a guitar and an amp. I mean, that's what I had. And as a teenager, I got a few pedals and things like that. But I was never one of these guys that was so into gear, and I think it's just because I was like, I got this. I got to work with what I have. But it is fun to read about that stuff. And it's part of the fun of being a guitar player, isn't it? Is all the toys. So I would say got a lot of benefit out of these early guitar magazines, at least for me, back in the 90s. Just reading about different players. I mean, that's how I got into Pantera. I remember as a kid in one of these issues just reading about, there's a very small, this was before Pantera got really big, there's a small little, couple paragraph article on one of the pages about, at the time, he was calling himself Diamond Daryl, okay? And I believe if you look at the liner notes of even Vulgar Display of Power, I believe he's still even called under his picture Diamond Daryl, okay? But just looked really cool as a kid, right? And the way they were talking about the record is like, wow, I really should check this out. And that's how I would learn, and I'm sure many of you who went through the same process, how you learned about new players, right? Again, because you didn't have all the, the just the deluge of data points and MP3 stuff and downloads and streaming and YouTube and all this stuff. Again, the double-edged sword, all that stuff is just too much, man. More is not always better, especially when it comes to data points and sensory input, man. It's just not always better. Okay, and the magazines were a certain filter. Again, where these guys, I think, worked a little bit harder to try and get in front of people. So anyway, I would learn about guys. I learned about corrosion of conformity that way, big time. Again, it just looked cool. They had a cool spread. He had an SG all beat up. I mean, I was really into SGs back then. I didn't have one at the time, but I was like, wow, because Angus Young had an SG, right? So the SG caught my eye. But learn about corrosion of conformity that way, COC. So those were primarily really the biggest benefit for me. Were those magazines getting me into new music? I learned about Frank Zappa because when I got into Steve Vai, I learned through the guitar magazines that Steve Vai played for Frank Zappa. That's why I started getting the Zappa stuff. Really just at first, because I wanted to hear Steve Vai more. I'm like, wow. And then I just got into Zappa. So these were very important things for a developing musician back then. And now the things that I think were better about Guitar for the Practicing Musician, right, versus, let's say, Guitar World. At a certain point later in the 90s, I had a subscription to both of those at one point, okay? I found the transcriptions were good for both. I did find that at the time, Guitar for the Practicing Musician just had better transcriptions. I just thought they were a bit more accurate, even though, again, I was no expert back then, certainly. But even seeing some of the things later on, as a professional player, seeing, because you can find some of these things online, right? And some of the copies, PDF stuff. They had good transcribers back then. I don't know who they were, but I liked those a lot. I thought that Guitar for the Practicing Musician, especially in the earlier times, I thought they were more focused on guitar stuff for guitar players. Like, in other words, I thought they had more stuff. Your guys like your George Lynch's, your Steve Vai's, your Joe Satriani's, less pop stuff, right? Less rock stuff. I thought, your Guitar World would have more of like Metallica. They'd have more of stuff you'd hear on the radio. That was at least my determination back then, and I gravitated towards Guitar for the Practicing Musician. And it's a shame it went out of business. I think that went out of business, like late 90s? Maybe? Mid-90s? Something like that? I used to have a whole stack of those, as I'm sure many of you. And it's kind of like comic books, when you're a kid and you wish as an adult, oh man, I wish I had all those Spider-Man comics. It's probably worth some money. Well, I got rid of them. I was moving as a young adult, and I just had stacks and stacks of these. And for a while, I had them at one of the music shops that I was teaching out of. Just almost like a lending library. I would let my students borrow some of them, and they'd bring them back and whatnot. Again, before we had all the phones where you could do PDFs or whatever on the fly. But I got rid of them. It was just too much to lug around, and I do regret doing that. Because as I'm about to talk about now, the little lessons in those were also, I think, of a higher caliber than some of the little lessons in Guitar World. But let's talk about the lessons. Let's talk about the lessons in any of these guitar magazines, right? I would say if there's anything in those magazines that people just gloss over the most, where their eyes just kind of glaze over, right? They're looking at these things. It's when you see those columns, those lessons, and the people might catch your eye. Oh, it's Alex Skolnick from Testament. Oh, it's Eric Peterson from Testament, or oh, it's Joe Satriani, whatever. Joe Satriani is the exception, which I'll come back to. But a lot of these columns, these articles, right? They're just assuming a lot of knowledge that the reader doesn't have. And this is a big pet peeve I have with guitar instruction in general. This is something I really try to avoid with all the Metal Guitar Academy stuff, is you can't assume that people know stuff. If you start talking about, hey, how to solo over a E major 7 chord, right? Let's say that's the topic for one of these columns, one of these little lessons in the magazines. Well, they're going to start talking about all the scales. Hey, you play Lydian scale and all that stuff. Most people don't know what an E major 7 chord is. And if you don't know what that is, you're not going to know what the hell the guy is talking about soloing over it. You're just not. And that's always a problem I had. And I think that's why a lot of people just gloss over those sections of the magazine. Now, again, maybe that was just me, but I don't think so. I think a lot of people gloss over that because they're like, what the hell is he talking about? And they miss some of the important things they could learn if it was not assumed that the student knows something. Okay, I tend to find Guitar Player is kind of the word, Guitar Player magazine. To me, out of the big three, Guitar for the Practicing Musician, Guitar World, and Guitar Player, I really stayed away from Guitar Player. A, it didn't have the transcriptions, so what fun is that? You're picking the thing up because it's like, wow, it's got this Pantera song, I want to learn it. Guitar Player never really had that, so that right away turned me off to Guitar Player. And they had so many of these lessons, right? And a lot of stuff that was aimed less towards rock and metal. That's another reason I liked the other two. they definitely had a rock and metal kind of an edge to it. Shred, at the time in the early 90s. Guitar player, I don't care about some dude sitting there with his with his jazz guitar. Listen, I'm going to rant about jazz quite a bit during these podcasts. Okay, I don't like it very much, and I'm going to qualify that by saying it's not the harmonies, it's not the scales, it's not all that stuff is really cool. But frankly, you find that in everything. Okay, you find that in prog metal, you find that in a lot of the cool rock stuff, and there's this veneer of sophistication, right, that a lot of these jazz people have over the stuff, almost like they invented these things. Well, nope. Why don't you go ahead and go back to composers, turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. These are the guys that pioneered all that more modern-sounding stuff, guys like Bartok, Ravel, Stravinsky, Sibelius, all these great composers. And the jazz dudes, sure, they took up this stuff and certainly made it more improvisational, which if I have to say one, thing I really do respect about good jazz players is they really know the hell out of their instrument, and you really have to. But that being said, the phrasing usually sucks. Okay, the creativity often isn't there because they come out of a school like Berkeley and it's almost like, a chord factory where you just kind of learn all the same stuff and they apply it all the same. And I find it to really be kind of ballless, a lot of this stuff, unless you're talking like fusion where it's got this more of a rock edge. I mean, I like that stuff. But yeah, you'll find a lot of these concepts, and I teach these concepts. I teach what you could consider to be jazz theory, jazz things, but you have to know how to put it into a rock or a metal context for it really to be fun for most people to play, myself included. Okay, so I'm just not a jazz guy, and again, I think there's an attitude there that's sort of this elitist kind of an attitude. Little anecdote, I was at up in the Woodstock area a number of years ago. They used to have a big luthiers convention, kind of more like a trade show. Not huge, but I mean big enough, and just beautiful handmade acoustic guitars. These things were just like $15,000 guitars. You know what I mean? And they just had luthiers coming in from all over the world. Just really fantastic handmade acoustic guitars, right? But there was a little cafe-ish performance venue at this place, and that particular day they had a duo, two guitar players, just unaccompanied electric guitar, jazz, right? And my God, did it sound horrible. It sounded like two guys playing two different songs at the same time. And that's kind of a joke a little bit about jazz, but that's what this sounded like. And I was just, internally smiling about this because I've dealt with this a lot before. And I'm looking around and you see people just kind of nodding their head and looking at each other like, yeah, this is really good, man. Really good. Guarantee you the internal dialogue, really, in their heads was, oh my God, this sounds really bad. But it's jazz. So it must be good, and I must be stupid if I don't like it, so I got to pretend that I like it, otherwise people are going to think I'm stupid. It's this emperor's new clothes kind of a thing, a lot of times, right? In fact, if you could slow down a lot of jazz recordings, boy, I'm going to get some probably pushback on this. But listen, I'm correct about this. I told you I'm opinionated about these things. I'm correct about this. If you slow down a lot of jazz recordings, okay, to like half speed or whatever, you're going to have like a third of all those notes that they're playing just sound like total crap. And it's the fact that they're just kind of playing fast, a lot of these guys. Okay, now listen, this is not everybody. I'm not saying that this is, for example, Duke Ellington, right? I mean, he's considered obviously one of the really heavy hitters, okay, historically for jazz. That guy was an amazing composer. Now, I look at his stuff, also Henry Mancini, right? These guys were composers, as I said, much like Ravel, Bartok, whatever. But you look at Duke Ellington. He's thought of as a jazz guy, sure, improv, whatever, piano player. I think he's just one of the greatest American composers. You listen to some of his solo piano pieces, again, that are composed, not improvised. They're just beautiful. They're really well done. And even though he's using that, what we could consider, the jazz language, all the chord extensions and all that kind of stuff, he was a composer. Same with Henry Mancini, who was a very famous film composer. He did all the Pink Panther soundtracks, a lot of stuff in the 60s, 70s. even 80s. And again, a wonderful composer. Those are the types of skills that one has to develop if they're going to take these materials, these raw materials for the jazz stuff, and actually pull it off and not just sound like you're just moving really fast, playing whatever note you think is going to sound good. So that's my shtick about jazz. I'll probably talk about it even more. But anyway, they had a lot more of that kind of stuff in Guitar Player magazine. So I tended to avoid that. The guitar for the practicing musician, right? I liked the interviews better as well. I did. I liked the interviews better. They had some really cool. I remember this one thing they had is called the listening room or something, and they would have a guitar player come in, and they would play them songs from other records, other guitar players, and they would have the guy comment on it and give his feedback, right? And it was always fun when they'd get someone like an Yngwie coming in there, because he would always just trash talk everything, right? And you could tell it was kind of just like he was having fun with it. He kind of knew the reputation he had of being a trash talker, and he actually had to issue a little bit of an apology. I remember after they had him in there in the letters section of the next month's issue. It's kind of saying, hey, this was kind of in jest. I'm just having fun with you guys and whatever. But because he got a lot of heat on that, he was trash talking Dimebag. He was trash talking. I even want to say like Joe Satriani or something. I mean, he was just trash talking everybody, saying, "Oh, my song." That's what it was. They listened to the song "Crying" by Joe Satriani off of the Extremist record, which is a great song. And Yngwie's like, my song, whatever the name was, blows this song out of the water. And so he was doing that with all the songs, really just a lot of self-aggrandizement, which was fun to read. They'd also have guys in there, again, if you start getting into like kind of mid-90s and 93, 94, this was grunge era. And I'll tell you what, as a burgeoning guitar player at that age, like a very early teenager, 13, 14, just getting into the Steve Vai's and the Yngwies and all this stuff and Pantera, I just had this burning desire to get good at the guitar, okay? And unfortunately, all the magazines, Guitar World and Guitar for the Practice Musician, they were starting to cover a bit too much of these kind of the Lollapaloozers, I would call them. Like, Lollapalooza was a big deal. So you had all these sort of like grunge and what they'd call alternative, and this was a lot of this stuff was just really bad, and again, if you're a fan of these bands, okay, everyone's entitled, a lot of people don't like AC/DC. I mean, I love AC/DC, that's fine. But if we're looking at it objectively, you had all these guys from these bands like Blind Melon. I remember Blind Melon, whoever the hell they were, the guys in that band, going into that listening room thing. And one of the songs they played was Dream Theater, Pull Me Under, off of Images and Words. What a fantastic song that is. And all they did was trash talk that, going, oh, this guy, it sounds like he hits a note and like a million lights light up on his rack unit. They're just saying these things like that. And this is Blind Melon, and you're going to sit there and, trash talk Dream Theater and John Petrucci, That really bothered me. That left a bad taste in my mouth for a few years with these magazines. They focused way too much on these grunge people, the popular people, and really, they would give these interviews. And they'd say these ridiculous things like, well, you should never practice because you're just going to end up sounding like everybody else, so I never practice. It's like, and even as a kid, I'm like, come on, that's like having some big fat person be your personal trainer, right? And they're going to go, oh, you shouldn't exercise because you're just going to end up looking like everybody else, Give me a break, man. They would say this ridiculous stuff. They say, I never practice. Be like, oh, reading music is stupid. You're just going to, like, start sounding like... That was the big thing. I guess if you got better in these people's world, you would just sound like everybody else, right? And what a inversion of reality that is, my friends, right? We know that's not true at all. You continually increase your palate. If you don't hear, let's say, certain chords, okay, if you're not exposed to those sounds, they're just not in your wheelhouse. They're not. Your palette is not wide enough and diverse enough musically to even ever stumble upon those on your own. And if you did, you wouldn't know what to do with it. you wouldn't be able to develop the idea. So that really was something in the magazines that I thought they did start to stray too far from the good players, and they were going a little bit to what was popular, what was selling. And I'm, as a guitar player, I wasn't buying the magazine for that. You could have picked up like Rolling Stone or like, one of these teen fan, magazines. If you want to read about Nirvana, or you want to read about like, Jesus and Mary Chain, or like these Lollapalooza kind of things. I'm buying this magazine because I want to read about guys that are way better, and I want to learn, and I want to find out, new guys that I can get into. So that was kind of annoying with those magazines, certainly. Now, pardon me. So listen, that's about it. Again, I'm gonna call this one. I'm gonna wrap it. We're gonna put it in the can, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. I think about half hour or so is pretty good for these things. Otherwise, I probably just start sounding like an old man complaining about things, and that's not what we want to do. So, I will say this. Listen, I was just talking about chords. Commercial for you. Check out Chordcraft Crash Course on metalguitaracademy.com. This is a course I put together, and you're just going to learn the hell out of chords. This starts from the very beginning, goes all the way through, so that by the end of the course you end up understanding, what's something like a, 7, A major 7 sharp 5 kind of thing, or, flat 13s, all these things that people look at and, they just want to pass out or just want to vomit or something. They see these. This is a course that has, I think, well over 4 hours of video. It's broken up into sessions. It's got pages upon pages of written notes that go with the explanations. And these are not fancy schmancy things with 10 different angles and all this crap. You don't need that. This is me talking at you. I'm demonstrating on video, and I'm explaining to you, and I'm writing things on the screen, much like I do in my private lessons. And so this is a killer course, and you should check it out, Chordcraft Crash Course. So there you go. That's a nice segue, right, into a little Metal Guitar Academy commercial. All right, guys, I really appreciate you listening. And again, as we do these, I'm hoping to kind of get better, more entertaining for you. And I hope you appreciate it too. And I definitely appreciate you guys. All right, until next time.